This video is a Christian view of the controversial subject of gender identity.
Welcome, and thank you for letting me be here today. I have a lot to cover in only 30 minutes. So what is transgenderism? This term is a lot more loaded than you might think. The suffix ism can describe a disease condition like autism or hyperthyroidism. It can be a habit or predilection like altruism or racism, or it can be an ideology like capitalism or Marxism. Now, some activists object to the use of the word transgenderism because it's implying it's just an ideology. But when I did a quick search on Google, there are over 28,000 scholarly papers that use this term. So I'm going to go with it. For the next 30 minutes, transgenderism simply means a state of being transgender, whatever that means. So what does it mean? Most commonly, it describes an individual who identifies with a gender that does not correspond to their sex. Beyond that, we run quite suddenly into a series of contradictions and conundrums. What is gender? Nobody can agree on that. As it was reported this summer, a 5-year project funded by the EU was unable to agree on a definition despite over $4 million in funding. I would have been happy to give them a definition for half that amount. So what did they say? They quote, and I quote, "With teams from a variety of backgrounds, it was important to explore definitions of sex and gender in our discussions. What clearly emerged from the study, presentations, and ensuing discussions was that sex and gender often interacted and were difficult to tease apart. Defining and documenting gender was found to be complex, challenging, and was approached in diverse ways in the funded studies." Now, various claims are made by those in the category of advocates who I'll refer to as gender affirming. One is that sex and gender are independent of one another or only loosely linked. But if sex and gender are different, then what is gender? There's no diagnostic test for it. It comes down to whatever the person claims for him or herself or their self. Is it ontologically possible to have a body of one sex and the mind of another? But then, if so, aren't you still defining gender in terms of sex? And how would one know they feel like the opposite sex, having never been there? Not being a woman, I could never know how it felt to have the mind of a woman. So in practice, this really reduces to filtering one's own personality and preferences through highly stereotypical views of masculinity and femininity. The implication seems to be that gender is a personal trait like extroversion or left-handedness, that it is innate, immutable, and independent of sex, except those things can be observed by another party. But if it's not sex, from what part of the mind or body does gender originate? Nobody can say. It's almost Aristotelian, as if there were transcendental forms of male, female, and other in the realm of being that constitute the substance of a person, even if the accident is of the opposite sex. And this is kind of like how the transubstantiation works in the Catholic Eucharist. But if gender exists only in the mind of the perceiver, it is unfalsifiable. To believe it is to see it. Or is it? Maybe we can test that theory. Now, within the population that might be described as gender affirming, there are at least 3 popular interpretations that are mostly contradictory. One camp takes the position that transgenderism is biologically based but dysfunctional. Now, DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it serves as a reference for the categorization and diagnosis of mental illness. Now, we're now in the 5th edition, which came out in 2013. This position, that it's a mental illness, would have been the consensus of almost the entire scientific community before the DSM-5, when it was called gender identity disorder. The manual changed in 2013, but that doesn't mean everybody's on board. The ones who still think of it as a mental illness may or may not support gender affirmation in young people. A second position, which is also common, is that transgenderism is biologically based but merely a normal variant. The DSM-5 depathologized cross-sex gender identification, meaning it's no longer considered a disorder of any sort. For those who accept this framework, people really are the gender they identify as, whether they actually transition or not. And this group would totally support gender affirmation. But there's a third camp that says biology has little or nothing to do with it. It is socially constructed, pure and simple, and that's okay. Now, this point of view is reflected more among philosophers like Michel Foucault or Judith Butler, and the ones in this camp vigorously support gender affirmation. On the other hand, among the gender-critical group, we also see competing interpretations. One, that it's a mental illness in the classic sense. Again, this was a mainstream position until 2013, except this group would tend not to support the so-called gender affirmation. Second, it's just a delusion, just another example of somebody passionate believing in something that doesn't correspond to reality. Number three, it is a social contagion where young people imitate those they admire in an effort to gain acceptance or look cool. Or number four, it's a self-selected identity, a consequence of expressive individualism as described by Charles Taylor. And Carl Trueman did a great job of explaining how this viewpoint emerged as a reigning paradigm, but it's not necessarily all-encompassing. In other words, it doesn't necessarily explain all cases. So these explanations are not mutually exclusive. Most of these could be true in some cases, although the normal variant viewpoint really doesn't play well with the other positions. On the other hand, it's interesting that the last three gender-critical explanations are perfectly consistent with it being a social construct, differing from Judith Butler only in the sense of it being a negative thing. So with so many different viewpoints, you can see where there might be so much heat and so little light. It's difficult to prove or disprove something when nobody can agree on what it is. It's kind of like nailing Jell-O to the wall. So how does neuroscience factor into this discussion? In several ways. First, those in the affirming community regularly trumpet the latest study claiming to prove that gender is both innate and independent of sex. By the way, this puts them in direct conflict with the social construct contingent. The Butler camp continues to deny that there are any sex-related differences, even between male and female, in the brain. And they say gender is just the second verse of the same song. Second, these different hypotheses regarding transgenderism enable us to make some predictions that can be tested. And third, an accumulated body of neuroscience was already in place well before transgenderism captured global attention. This earlier understanding can inform our thinking. Now, advocates may say that social and medical transitioning merely brings the body into line with the mind, but what if it goes the other way? What if the cart is pulling the horse, meaning that gender affirmation changes the brain? So I'm going to structure this talk in the form of four essential questions. First, what is neuroscience? Second, what does it have to do with transgenderism? Three, what does the research show? And finally, four, how should neuroscience inform our understanding of transgenderism? In July of 1989, President George Bush signed a proclamation declaring the 1990s as the decade of the brain. And what emerged over the ensuing decade and continues to today is an explosion of research into the human brain, how it forms, how it works, and how things go wrong. Neuroscience is a broad field that includes anatomy, biology, chemistry, psychology, sociology, and multiple medical specialties, including my own specialty of neuroradiology. In the case of transgenderism, however, hardly any research had been done prior to the mid-2000s, mostly because it's rare. This chart indicates the number of neuroimaging studies that included transgender participants, rising from 1 in 1991 to 83 in 2024. Now, we have a lot of different ways to study the brain. This can include behavioral study and psychological testing, chemical analysis of hormones and neurotransmitters like testosterone and estrogen and dopamine, examination of brain structure by MRI in living people. This is what we call gross anatomy, which means you can see it without a microscope. We have functional imaging, particularly using MRI. Brain regions that are active use more oxygen and demand more blood flow, so we can use MRI to look at changes in blood flow at rest or during particular brain tasks. We also have the option of post-mortem analysis and brain dissection, but for obvious reasons, this is less helpful in humans. And lastly, not all research has to use humans. We've learned vast amounts from the study of animal models. So in the case of transgenderism, neuroscience can and has been used to elucidate differences in the brain in an attempt to explain it, to test hypotheses concerning its cause, and to predict the outcome of interventions. Now, I'd say at the outset that even if research finds that transgender brains differ in certain respects, that really doesn't narrow the range of possible explanations as much as you might think. Finding changes in the brain wouldn't necessarily prove whether it was biologically based, a normal variant, or a mental illness. All of those can cause brain changes on imaging. Now, setting aside for the moment all the disagreement over what transgender is, a popular version in public use boils down to the claim that one can have a male brain in a female body or a female brain with a male body. Now, if there were a way to tell male brains from female brains, we could look at the brains of transgender people and see if their brain matches their sex or their gender identity. So can we? As a matter of fact, the very idea that male and female brains might possibly be different was a matter of hot contention for quite some time. But over time, the evidence continues to pile up. Little boys and girls differ in many ways. Almost every parent and teacher knows that, so there was always a good reason to think male and female brains were different. This would be the best explanation for consistent and reproducible differences in personality and behavior seen not only in human children, but many higher primates. Many psychiatric and neurological disorders show a strong sex predilection, whether it be autism in males or Alzheimer's disease in females. Also, the obvious realization that men and women differ in their genetic makeup and experience different hormonal influences during critical periods of development. So if there are differences between male and female brains, these could show up in many different ways. Differences in visible structure could be explored in living subjects using high-resolution MRI scanning. Differences in microstructure would require more precise microscopic analysis, meaning either post-mortem examination or animal studies. Differences in the chemical environment via such modulators as hormones and neurotransmitters are less amenable to study by imaging. But differences in brain function can be explored using specialized MRI techniques that look at blood flow and brain activation using what we call functional MRI. So what do we know? Simply looking at brain structure with MRI, subtle differences emerge that are detectable by computer analysis but imperceptible to the human eye. Over my career of 40 years, I've looked at thousands and tens of thousands of MRI scans, and I could not tell a male brain from a female brain without looking at the name. You just can't. But brain size corresponds to body size, and because men are on average larger, male brains average about 9% larger than female brains. But female brains make up the difference with a higher density of neurons in the same volume of gray matter. Also in women, the gray matter is a little thicker, whereas male brains have a higher percentage of white matter. Male brains show more interconnection within the hemispheres, whereas female brains show more connection between the hemispheres. With functional MRI that looks at active communication between various brain networks, researchers are now reporting extraordinary accuracy in distinguishing male from female brains and identifying which brain regions differ most greatly. The differences are bimodal, meaning two distinct peaks with a valley in the middle. The fat in the back of this Bactrian Campbell is bimodally distributed. Bimodal is really quite different from a spectrum or continuum, and these brain differences begin to develop in utero in response to circulating sex hormones. They're in place long before puberty. So by the middle of the last decade, most neuroscientists consider the matter as settled. The entire January 2017 issue of the Journal of Neuroscience Research was dedicated to evidence for sex-based brain differences. In his introduction, journal editor Larry Cahill wrote, "The notion that sex matters fundamentally, powerfully, and pervasively for all of neuroscience, not just for reproduction, is an idea whose time indeed has come." So this has been effectively settled, but that doesn't mean there aren't still a lot of diehards who refuse to bow to the evidence, and almost all of them are in the Judith Butler camp. So where does this leave us? Since it's reasonably possible to tell whether a brain is more male or female based on sophisticated imaging techniques, it is possible to study transgender subjects and determine whether their brain corresponds closer to their sex or their gender identity. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk through a few studies from the last 4 years. The results are mixed, although the most recent studies indicate that transgender brains are much closer to their own sex than the opposite sex. The titles and the source of all these are on the top of the slides if you want to check it out, but I'm not going to read them as I go. This study, reported in 2020, used a machine algorithm to try and differentiate male and female brains based on structure, and then applied the rules they developed to 26 trans women born male. In the trans subjects, the discriminator was less accurate in predicting a male brain. In other words, the brains of trans women deviated a little from the average male brain and were a little more likely to be misclassified as female. They concluded it was somewhat of a wash, not your average male brain, but not female either. Quoting verbatim, "Our results support the hypothesis that male brain structure in trans women differs from the brain structure of their biological sex as well as their perceived gender." That same year, another group used functional MRI on a group of 92 subjects equally divided between men, women, and trans men, with 26 in each group. This method basically looks at which regions of the brain are talking with each other. So they applied a machine learning technique to try and separate the 4 groups, then retrospectively applied that technique to the same group of subjects, claiming the ability to predict better than mere chance. There were several flaws with this study. The accuracy rate, though higher than chance, remained rather low. 25% would have been random. But what's worse is that they applied their tool to the same set of patients they used to develop the tool. They should have applied the rule to a set of unknown patients to result in any kind of meaningful data. Another report 1 year later looked just at structural MRI with a subject group of 214 trans men, 172 trans women, 196 women, and 221 men. They claimed to find significant differences between cisgender and transgender subjects in the volumes of some regions of the brain. But rather than being merely shifted toward either end of the male-female spectrum, transgender persons seem to present with their own unique brain phenotype. But what did they not find? They didn't find that trans men brains looked more male or that trans women brains looked more female. That same year, another group published a review. So this is going back over 39 studies reporting brain imaging in transgender subjects. They noted that these 39 projects were extremely heterogeneous, both in terms of the patient profiles and the techniques that were utilized. The authors acknowledged that almost all the studies found some difference between transgender and cisgender subjects, but they still remained closer to their own sex than their gender identity. I might insert that the chances of a study being published if it found no difference is significantly less. There's a bias against publishing research with negative findings. But quoting again verbatim, "Our results suggest that some features in transgender individuals resemble those of their experienced gender, despite the majority, emphasize, the majority resembling those from their natal sex." A newer and much larger study came from the Netherlands in 2023 using structural imaging in adolescents in the age range of 13 to 15. And I quote, "In this cross-sectional study of 2,165 adolescents from the Netherlands, no significant differences in total brain volumetric measures." What's volumetric? Just looking at the size of things in the brain. "No significant differences were observed between youths who reported gender diversity and youths who did not. The results did point to one possible area of difference, but only in those born boys. However, these findings further suggest that gender diversity in the general population correlates with specific brain morphological features in the inferior temporal gyrus among youths who are assigned male at birth." Now, some of these earlier studies didn't take head size into account, which would throw the findings off one way or the other, since that's one of the most consistent differences between male and female brains. This 2023 report using structural imaging found that after taking the total intracranial volume into account, that the model is equally accurate in determining sex in both cis and trans subjects. In other words, their brains match their sex, not their gender identity. Bringing us now into 2024, this study reported the results of functional imaging in 19 trans men, that's female to male. Because it's functional imaging, it also has implications for cognition and behavior. And the researchers reported that contrary to the assumption that cognitive function in trans individuals aligns more closely with their gender identity counterpart, our findings suggest a similar cognitive profile between trans men and cisgender women. In other words, they match their sex, not their gender identity. This last paper appeared in mid-2024 and made a small splash. The researchers examined a data set of thousands of children aged 9 to 20 and used functional MRI first to look for correlations with their sex and then to look for correlations with gender identity. And of course, there's no test for gender identity, so they asked the children a few questions and asked their parents about play behavior and used that as a proxy. They claimed that the research supported the idea that sex and gender correlate with different brain regions and thus could be different things. This is what they actually found. They found that certain brain regions were correlated with sex, but gender was more distributed throughout the cerebral cortex. Sex and gender were strongly correlated, so predicting gender was simple if you just used sex as a criteria. In other words, if you knew they were male and you predicted gender male, you would be right 99% of the time. However, their ability to predict gender apart from sex was less accurate. In other words, they were unable to predict whether their boy would identify as female or other. My critique of this study would be that the deck was stacked the moment they defined gender. If you define gender in terms unrelated to biological sex, then that is going to be a likely result. Finally, a major shortcoming of all these studies is that they don't attempt to distinguish between early and late onset cases, and some were done almost entirely or entirely on adults. They may not even be relevant to adolescent onset cases, which many of us believe should be in a category of their own. Since there's no diagnostic test for transgender, we can't really know if all of the transgender subjects were trans, nor whether all the control subjects were not. It's really hard to study something that you can't define and can't objectively determine. Summing up those reports, we can infer that in some respects, a transgender brain could be less masculinized in a male or less feminized in a female, but this is true of many who are not trans. Male and female brains differ, and the differences are in a bimodal distribution with some overlap. We've known for decades that the differences between boys and girls are population-wide and don't apply to every single child. Some girls are tomboys, and some little boys are bookish. That can be called gender atypia or gender nonconformity. It's totally normal. And we see evidence of it reflected in those studies showing male and female brain patterns spread out along those curves. One thing on which almost everyone agrees is that gender is a matter of personal identification. Well, identity formation is also something that has been closely studied before. Research has found that personal identity is linked to an area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is itself part of the default mode network. This brain network is the one engaged in self-awareness, self-reflection, and daydreaming. So if being transgender is a matter of identity, of course it wouldn't be related to sex-different regions. It's exactly what anyone should predict. Regions of the brain that differ between sex are not related to regions of the brain associated with identity formation. Therefore, it's completely plausible that gender identity can conflict with sex. Furthermore, identity formation is heavily influenced by social factors. This can be why Lisa Littman and Abigail Schreier found that many adolescent and pre-adolescent girls were being shaped by social media. So in conclusion, what does transgenderism look like through the lens of neuroscience? First, there is no evidence so far that a person of one sex can have a brain of the opposite sex. Even the studies that found a difference found a very small one, and the subjects still remain closer to their sex than their preferred gender. Second, be skeptical of all claims that imaging studies prove there is a transgender brain. Many earlier studies have been undermined by later research, and until someone can actually define gender, I don't see how it could ever be proved. Third, identity and sex involve different regions of the brain, so it's possible for them to diverge. That doesn't prove it's healthy or normal. Lastly, be wary that gender-affirming care is really gender-confirming care. And what do I mean by that? The adult human brain is determined by a lot of factors beyond our genes. The brain is adaptable, a child's brain much more so, and its growth is modulated by genetics, the hormonal environment, and social factors. Puberty is a critical window in brain development that is dependent upon sex hormones. This is not something we want to be messing around with. So far, there is little data on the long-term effects of puberty blockers in children, but what has been reported so far gives us cause for concern, like measurable declines in IQ. We can prove in the lab that puberty blockers can cause permanent and irreversible changes in brain development in animal models. To assume that it wouldn't happen in humans is dangerously naive. It's well established that the majority of children with gender dysphoria literally grow out of it. We call this desist, turning into adults at peace with their sexed bodies. But in the Tavistock series from the UK, the desistance rate after puberty blockers dropped from around 85% to a shocking 2%. Why is this bad, you might ask? Among many reasons, it can lead to permanent sterility, sexual dysfunction, and a lifetime on medication. But according to everything we know about child development, even social transitioning is self-reinforcing. Those seemingly harmless things like changing names and pronouns have a direct influence on the developing brain. Wrapping things up here, we conclude with this. The evidence so far confirms that the brains of trans individuals remain much more similar to their sex than their gender identity. The mind may shape treatment, but treatment shapes the mind. Next, this is a biggie that gets to what I think is the heart of the matter. To be gender atypical is a feature of our created diversity, not a disease, not something to be fixed. Be suspicious. Many extravagant claims are going to be made, but also be humble. Denigrating science or scientists reflects poorly upon us. There's a difference between a minority position versus a fringe position. You know, sometimes the minority is right, but it's really the extreme outliers turn out to be right. Lastly, don't be defensive. A Christian position does not exclude the possibility of brain alterations. And any brain findings related to transgenderism which have appeared or might appear cannot establish whether it is good, normal, or healthy. This is according to Hume's law, named after David Hume, that you cannot derive an ought from an is. Science can only look at how it is, not how it ought to be. So thank you. That's it.